3 decades ago, this tiny Pacific island of Nauru was one of the richest countries in the world. For a country with a landmass of just 8 square miles and a population of around 11,000, achieving this feat was unimaginable. Just like the Saudis have oil, Russia and Qatar have natural gas. The Republic of Nauru had a windfall in the form of phosphate deposits. Nauru, at the time, was the world's phosphate capital. This valuable mineral, used to create fertilizer and batteries, fueled Nauru's prosperity. And for a while, they did exactly what needed to be done. They invested the incomes from phosphates into trust funds, building a seemingly secure future. But as the saying goes, if you can't respect what you have, you'll soon be in trouble. And that's exactly what happened with Nauru, from the world's richest country to losing 90% of its GDP. So, how did Nauru secure this amount of insane wealth? Where did they go wrong in losing their precious possession, and how it impacted the economy of Nauru in the long run? Nauru was first discovered by the Europeans in 1789. The tiny island, nestled in the vast Pacific Ocean, caught the attention of explorers sailing through the region. Among them was Captain William Wentworth, an English navigator whose ship stumbled upon the island during a voyage in search of new trade routes. As Captain Wentworth and his crew approached the shores of Nauru, they were blown away by its untouched beauty. The lush greenery, crystal-clear waters, and vibrant coral reefs painted a picture of paradise. Eager to claim their discovery, the explorers planted a flag on the beach and named the island Pleasant Island, due to its relaxed environment. The island was a familiar friend. Every sunrise brought the same gentle waves lapping the shore, the same cries of seabirds overhead. Life moved at the rhythm of the tides. Sure, whispers of old feuds rumbled beneath the surface, and dry seasons brought worry lines to everyone's face. But for generations, the islanders had lived in harmony with their tiny world, a self-contained bubble of peace. Back then, Nauru wasn't very important to the colonial powers vying for control in the Pacific. But in 1899, everything changed. A geologist named Albert Ellis examined a rock-like object holding open a door in the Sydney office of the Pacific Islands Company, a trading and plantation firm. Initially thought to be petrified wood from Nauru, Ellis suspected otherwise. Soon, he found out it was high-grade phosphate ore, a powerful fertilizer with the potential to bring great wealth if its source could be found. It was the start of something big. In 1901, Ellis sailed to Nauru and discovered that most of the island's central flatland, called topside by the Nauruans, was filled with valuable phosphate rock. Ellis's company changed its name to better reflect its new business, Pacific Phosphate Company. By now, Australia was in charge of Nauru, having taken it from Germany at the beginning of World War I. It declared the island as a mining spot and started to focus on building mining equipment, making mining more refined and increasing exports. By the early 1920s, Nauru was exporting about 200,000 tons of phosphate each year. 20 years later, it was over 4 times that much, all sold cheaper than normal to help farmers in Australia, New Zealand, and Great Britain, a group called the British Phosphate Commissioners, organized by the League of Nations. As this was the era of the Second World War, Nauru too saw the dark side. Phosphate mining stopped for a while after Japan invaded Nauru in 1942. The Japanese soldiers were brutal. They beat people up, executed them without trials, and sent them away to work in camps. But for Nauru, the end of the war brought relief as Japan lost. Following the war, the United Nations placed Nauru under the trusteeship of Australia, Britain, and New Zealand. Australia once again took the lead role. Nauru's phosphate industry quickly revived, and within a few years, exports surpassed pre-war levels. This upward trend continued for the next 2 decades, whilst Australian and New Zealand farmers received significant discounts until 1963. By the time Nauru gained independence in 1968, a staggering amount of phosphate, over 35 million tons, had been shipped out. Imagine a line of dump trucks stretching from New York City all the way to Los Angeles and then back again. That's how much phosphate Nauru had exported. By 1968, a shocking sight greeted visitors to Nauru. 1/3 of the island had been carved up by strip mining, leaving behind a jagged wasteland of sharp coral and limestone. Nauruans were forced to live on a narrow strip of land around this plateau. However, the next 2 decades brought unexpected prosperity. Nauru's phosphate wealth boomed, creating a trust fund valued at over $1 billion Australian by 1975. The country's income per person, on average, was second only to Saudi Arabia's. While most Nauruans didn't live extravagantly, life certainly changed. There were no income taxes, education and healthcare were free, and the government, the main employer, provided generously. They even went on a spending spree, buying cruise ships, airplanes, and even hotels overseas. Politicians took chartered flights for shopping trips abroad. One interesting trend was the sudden fascination with sports cars. This might seem odd on such a small island, where a drive around the entire island took only 20 minutes. In fact, one police chief bought a Lamborghini, but found he couldn't even fit behind the wheel. As Nauruan Manoa Tongamalo later recalled in 2008, people would go into a shop, buy a few sweets, pay with a $50 note, and not take the change. They'd use money like toilet paper. During this period, Nauru was also seeking compensation from Australia, New Zealand, and Britain for the damage caused by mining before July 1967. Australia, as the supervisor, knew that the mining was harming Nauru. In the early 1960s, Australia suggested resettling Nauruans in Australia, even offering citizenship and some self-governance on Curtis Island in 1963. But after Nauru became independent, Australia refused to discuss compensating Nauru. After years of neglect, in 1989, Nauru took Australia to the International Court of Justice. Australia saw that Nauru had a strong case, and they settled out of court. Australia agreed to pay 57 million Australian dollars in 1994 and an additional 50 million Australian dollars over the next 20 years. Later, the UK and New Zealand each contributed 12 million Australian dollars to help ease Australia's burden. In some ways, this settlement was a moral and legal win for Nauru, but considering the damage caused, the compensation was a mere drop in the ocean. The Nauruan Empire started crumbling. In an effort to broaden its economy before phosphate reserves were depleted, Nauru ventured into offshore banking, granting licenses to about 400 foreign banks by the early 1990s. Tony Ottawa, overseeing bank licensing in 1991, explained the government's rationale to the Australian. Once the phosphate industry ends, we need to explore other sectors that can provide ongoing income. Setting up a bank in Nauru didn't even require a visit to the island, let alone establishing a physical branch. Maintaining bank records was optional. By the mid-1990s, Nauru also began offering economic citizenship, selling Nauruan passports with minimal scrutiny. While the Nauruan government did generate millions of dollars annually in fees, these initiatives transformed Nauru into a hub for tax evasion and money laundering, with tens of billions of dollars in illicit profits flowing through the tiny island during the 1990s. Offshore banking and passport sales couldn't solve Nauru's financial problems. Struggling for income and jobs, Nauru made a bitter decision in 2001. They allowed Australia to build a detention center on the island for processing asylum seekers attempting to reach Australia by boat. By 2002, about 1,000 asylum seekers, mostly from Afghanistan and Iraq, had been sent to Nauru. For a few years, Australian aid and processing fees brought in millions for the Nauruan government. However, even this arrangement couldn't fill the massive gap in Nauru's economy as primary phosphate reserves dried up. Throughout the 1990s, phosphate exports steadily declined. Although Nauru managed to export another 500,000 metric tons in 2000, by 2004, the phosphate boom was truly over, with exports plummeting to just 22,000 metric tons. By that time, Nauru's economy was in ruins. The government still wasn't earning any income tax, and most Nauruans worked for the government. Investments by the state had failed, and after years of spending more money than they had, the government had borrowed a lot from Nauru's savings to keep going. They were having trouble paying government workers and couldn't repay loans. So, in 2004, the Nauruan government agreed to let Australia take over managing the country's money again. The economic situation got even worse. In 2005, phosphate exports dropped to a record low of 8,000 metric tons. That same year, Nauru started to demand a physical presence to license banks in the country, basically ending offshore banking. Nauru was facing a lot of pressure from other countries to stop money laundering and selling passports. The US government even used the Patriot Act in 2001 to stop American banks from dealing with Nauru. Today, Nauru is still trying to figure out where it fits in the world economy. Since 2006, they've improved mining equipment and fixed up mining to get harder to reach phosphate. But the phosphate industry, producing about 45,000 metric tons a year, is nowhere near what it used to be. There's some leftover phosphate on topside, and maybe around 20 million metric tons in other spots. They're planning to mine this last bit of phosphate, but nobody thinks it'll solve their money problems for long. There was one last effort to find financial security, but it also ended in disaster. Nauru famously became one of the biggest failures in London theater history. They had invested in a musical called Leonardo the Musical, a portrait of love, which told a made-up story about love involving Da Vinci, Mona Lisa, and a soldier. Unfortunately, the musical was a total disaster, and Nauru couldn't afford any more losses. By 2001, they had run out of phosphate, and most of their foreign investments had failed. At that point, the country was completely broke, with a tiny GDP of $32 million when adjusted for inflation. Unemployment shot up to 90%, and the school system mostly fell apart. The current situation is so bad that some call Nauru a colony of refugees. At present, the situation of the once cherished country is horrendous. In 2007, Australia shut down a holding center for asylum seekers on Nauru. But just a few years later, in 2012, they opened it back up. The Australian leader at the time, Tony Abbott, even said Nauru was a nice place to live. He wanted to make the center bigger to hold much more people, even though Nauru doesn't have its own fresh water supply. By 2014, over 1,200 asylum seekers were stuck in Nauru. They came from countries like Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and Iran. The conditions were rough, dusty and dry during dry times, and muddy and unpleasant when it rained. Detainees protested by going on hunger strikes and sewing their lips together. In July 2013, a riot erupted, damaging much of the detention facility, which was quickly rebuilt. Amnesty International's Graham Tom criticized the camp as extraordinarily ill-conceived and cruel. Marianne Evers, an Australian nurse who worked at the camp, described the conditions on Australian TV. There is absolutely nothing to do. There are no trees, no grass, not even many birds. We live in that heat without air conditioning and tents. It's just desperation that I can't get out of my head. All of them are suffering. Nauru has lost basically everything. Most of the island's original trees and plants, about 80%, are gone. In their place, millions of tons of phosphate were dug up, around 80 million tons. Imagine a line of dump trucks, all the way from New York City to Tokyo and then back again, filled with phosphate. That's how much Nauru exported to date. And this all came from a tiny island, just 1/3 the size of Manhattan. Sadly, this progress came at a cost. James Aingamea, a church minister who lived on Nauru until his death in 1999, longed for the island's past. In 1995, he spoke with a reporter from the New York Times and expressed his regret. "I wish we'd never found that phosphate. I wish Nauru could be like it was before. When I was a boy, it was so beautiful. There were trees everywhere, it was green, and we could eat fresh coconuts and breadfruit. Now I see what has happened here, and I want to cry." Minister Aingamea knew his wish could never come true, but he still felt it deeply. Nauru is currently struggling, and it's not every day you see the wealthiest places become poor. Everyone should learn from this experience. It goes to show how utilization of resources is more important than having just resources. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content.